Buenos Aires thought the fire was far away. Then two bombings, tied by Argentina's courts to Hezbollah and Iran, tore open the city. The question that still haunts the country is simple and terrifying. How did a war born across the ocean learn the map of Buenos Aires? Because the bombs were only the part people heard. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore. From Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. A city can spend its whole life believing the distant fire will stay distant. Then one afternoon, the glass folds inward, the street becomes a wound, and Buenos Aires learns that wars born on another shore can still arrive in a South American capital with dust in their teeth. That is the question hanging over this whole story from the first breath. How did a conflict rooted in Lebanon, Israel, and Iran leave two craters in Argentina and a long shadow over the rest of Latin America? The clean answer is narrower, and because of that, more disturbing than the loudest conspiracy theories. This is not a story about Hezbollah carrying out a long parade of proven mass casualty attacks across the whole region. The public record points most clearly to two completed bombings in Buenos Aires, one in 1992 and one in 1994. Beyond Argentina, the trail grows thicker in money, logistics, surveillance, facilitators, and disrupted plots than in finished atrocities. That difference matters because exaggeration can become its own kind of blindness. And before we walk those streets, we need to know who has entered the room. Hezbollah emerged in Lebanon during the Civil War, when many Shiites felt pushed to the margins, when Iran's revolution sent a new current through the region, and when Israel's invasion carved deeper violence into the land. It became a militia, a political force, a welfare machine, and one of Tehran's most important allies. That is why the Argentina story cannot be told as if one lone hand moved in the dark. So, when people ask whether this is a Hezbollah story or an Iran story, the records whisper back both. For decades, Argentine prosecutors and judges have kept returning to the same architecture. Iran, they say, sat closer to the strategic decision. Hezbollah, they say, was the operational arm. Tehran denied responsibility. Hezbollah denied responsibility. But the judicial line, the Interpol trail, the later sanctions, and the recent court language keep circling back to that partnership like a refrain the years have not managed to bury. And there is another question under the first one. Not only who did it, but why Argentina at all? One of the hardest answers left in the recent court record is that the later attack came as revenge after Argentina stepped back from nuclear cooperation with Tehran. In other words, Buenos Aires was not simply a random faraway city. In the official telling that hardened over time, it had become part of a geopolitical grudge. Once you understand that, the bombings stop looking like stray lightning. They start looking chosen. March 17th, 1992. Walk for a moment through Arroyo Street before the blast. Diplomatic quiet. Offices. School routines. Church walls. The sleepy arrogance of an ordinary afternoon. Then a car bomb detonates at the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. The embassy falls. Nearby buildings tear open. Smoke climbs over the neighborhood. In the memory most official commemorations keep, 29 people are killed and more than 200 are wounded. Argentina inhales a war it did not invent. That first crater matters because it shattered a psychological border before it shattered anything else. Until then, the Middle East could be treated by many Argentines as a tragedy from elsewhere, something seen on screens, discussed in editorials, and argued over in diplomatic language. After the blast, the illusion was gone. This was no longer a metaphor. It was blood, pressure in the lungs, and children close enough to the shockwave to understand history as something that could bend windows and bodies at the same time. A name surfaced from the smoke. The Islamic Jihad organization claimed responsibility, and it was widely understood to be linked to Hezbollah and Iran. That claim did not close the case, but it set the tone for everything that followed. Argentina, Israel, and the United States would keep circling the same accusation that the attack was not random, not homegrown, not a stray burst of madness, but part of a transnational design that had crossed the ocean with purpose and learned the map of Buenos Aires before it struck. Then comes the second blow, the one that makes the first feel less like an exception and more like a prelude. July 18th, 1994, a vehicle packed with explosives destroys the Argentine Israelite Mutual Association, known by its Spanish letters AMIA, in Buenos Aires. 85 people are killed, hundreds are wounded. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in Argentine history. If the embassy bombing was a warning, AMIA was the warning fulfilled. The second strike told Argentina that the first had never really ended. Stand there in the imagination for a second, not above the scene, but inside it. Papers lift into the air like pale birds. Concrete opens. Sirens arrive before language does. Families run toward a building that no longer looks like a building. The cruelty was not only the number of dead, it was the target itself. Argentina held the largest Jewish community in Latin America, and someone had mapped one of its civilian hearts, then turned that map into detonation. The bomb was also an argument. From that morning forward, the question hardened into iron. Was AMIA an Iranian-directed attack carried out by Hezbollah on South American soil? That obsession haunted courts, diplomats, intelligence services, victims' families, Jewish institutions, and the national conscience itself. Not only who planted the explosives, who ordered the wind, who wanted a delay, who needed the crime to dissolve into fog. AMIA stopped being only a criminal file. It became a country standing in its own dust, arguing with its shadows. And yes, the case did sink into fog. The investigation was marred by incompetence, corruption, and political conflict. That is one reason the wound never closed cleanly. In Argentina, AMIA became more than an act of terror. It became a lesson in what happens when justice walks into a swamp. Evidence, rumor, intelligence work, diplomacy, grief, and power all began to step on each other. The bomb had ended in seconds. The afterlife of the bomb did not. It learned to survive on paperwork and delays. Notice this. The story does not really move in a straight line from attack to truth. It moves like someone trying to cross a river on broken stones. One stone is the embassy. Another is AMIA. Then the path widens into something else. Not only attacks, but infrastructure. Not only perpetrators, but channels. Not only ideology, but commerce. That is where the Latin American dimension grows teeth, because the region begins to appear not only as a target, but as terrain. The place that keeps returning, like a refrain, is the tri-border area, where Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay lean into one another in a zone famous for movement, markets, contraband, and people who know how to disappear into legal gray. Mythmakers love this place because it sounds like a ready-made stage for secret empires. That is lazy storytelling, but the paper trail is serious enough without fantasy. In that border world, the records began to show not constant explosions, but arteries, money, fronts, routes, favors, and loyalties. In 2004, the United States Treasury described Assad Ahmad Barakat as a man with close ties to Hezbollah leadership who worked closely with extremists and suspected Hezbollah associates in that border zone. 2 years later, Treasury called his network there a major financial artery to Hezbollah in Lebanon. That phrase changes the frame. Latin America was not only a place where bombs had gone off, it was also a place where money, cover, and loyalty could travel. And money is its own kind of passport. A front business can be more useful than a speech. A remittance can move more quietly than a slogan. A warehouse, a customs contact, a cousin, a broker, a shop that looks ordinary from the sidewalk and means something else after midnight. This is how distant violence keeps a pulse without always announcing itself. The support architecture is less cinematic than a smoking crater, but often more revealing. Militant ecosystems live not only on ideology, they live on invoices, cover, and patience. This is where bad storytelling usually makes a mess. One lazy version says Hezbollah secretly ran the whole continent. Another says the tri-border story was nothing but paranoia. Both are shortcuts. The stronger reading is harder and more human. Borderlands attract shadow economies. Shadow economies attract people who know how to blur the lines between licit and illicit trade. And inside that blur, a network can raise money, move couriers, scout routes, and build protection without staging spectacular violence every week. Silence can be operational, not innocent. In 2007, the case pushed beyond national mourning and deeper into international memory. Interpol upheld the publication of 6 red notices requested by Argentina in the AMIA case. That did not convict anyone. It did not drag suspects in chains to Buenos Aires. A red notice is not a verdict. It is an alert, a signal, a way of telling the world that the file is still alive. The state was no longer only grieving, it was naming names and asking borders to remember. And even that moment carried its own bitterness. Those notices were tied to a fresh re-examination of the case after Judge Galeano, who had handled part of the investigation, had already been fired for corruption. There it was again, the same old Latin American ghost, not only terror, but rot around the effort to uncover it. The bombings destroyed buildings quickly. The investigation damaged trust slowly. By then, justice in Argentina was no longer just a destination. It was another terrain that had to be fought over. Then, instead of clarity, came another layer of fog. In 2013, Argentina approved a memorandum with Iran to create a truth commission around AMIA. Supporters presented it as a path through deadlock. Critics saw a velvet glove reaching toward evidence that had already survived too much handling. Jewish leaders warned that the pact could weaken the investigation. In the end, the agreement never truly came to life, but the gesture itself deepened suspicion in a country already tired of official fraud. That same year, prosecutor Alberto Nisman widened the map. He argued that Iran had built intelligence and terrorist networks across parts of Latin America dating back decades. Whether one accepted every brick of his theory or not, the impact was enormous. AMIA stopped looking like only an Argentine tragedy. It started to look like a window into a broader architecture in which diplomacy, business fronts, diaspora routes, intelligence work, and covert logistics could brush against one another. January 2015, days after accusing then-President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner of helping cover up Iran's alleged role, Nisman was found dead in his apartment. The bombing was one national trauma. The prosecutor's death became another. In public memory, his body entered the same haunted corridor as the broken walls, the red notices, and the archive boxes. Whatever side people took afterward, his death deepened the feeling that this case was protected by delay, confusion, and fear. In December of 2017, a federal judge ruled that Nisman's death was murder, not suicide. That ruling did not resolve every argument, and it did not solve AMIA by magic, but it hardened something in the national imagination. It suggested that the darkness around the case was not only metaphorical. Argentina had spent years wondering whether the rot was bureaucratic, political, or criminal. The ruling told many people the answer might be all three at once, braided together like wire. By July of 2019, the Argentine state changed its language formally and materially. Hezbollah was designated a terrorist organization, and its assets were frozen. That mattered because the group was no longer being treated only as an old suspect tied to old bloodstains. The state said the threat had financial and present tense dimensions as well. The bombings were not being sealed in a museum case. They were still shaping policy. The past had not remained past. It had kept the Republic's pulse. And the public record kept thickening. In September of 2023, the United States Treasury designated Amir Mohammed Akil Rada. Treasury said he had served in an operational role for Hezbollah in South America for more than a decade, helped case targets around the region, carried out the AMIA bombing, and was also allegedly involved in the embassy bombing of 1992. That is not vague bureaucratic fog. It is one of the clearest recent public statements tying an operative to both Buenos Aires attacks. A few months later, in December of 2023, the United States Justice Department unsealed charges against Samuel Salman El-Reda. He was a senior Hezbollah operative, a dual Colombian-Lebanese citizen, and that he helped plan and execute the bombing while participating in Hezbollah operations in South America, Asia, and Lebanon. Notice the geography. Buenos Aires was not being described as an isolated stage. It appeared inside a broader operational map, one where Latin America was part of the route, not an accident beside it. That same year, Brazil offered another warning, but in a different register. Federal police launched Operation Trapiche to interrupt preparatory acts of terrorism and gather evidence of possible recruitment of Brazilians for extremist acts. Reports around the operation said the intended targets were Jewish and Israeli sites in Brazil and linked the plot to Hezbollah. Serious, yes, but still different from another AMIA. This was the architecture surfacing before detonation. The region was being shown the network in motion before the crater had a chance to appear. Peru had already offered a similar lesson years earlier. In 2014, police there moved against a man they alleged was tied to Hezbollah after finding traces of explosives and claiming he had confessed to membership. That was treated as a suspected plot, not as a completed mass casualty attack on the scale of Buenos Aires. The distinction matters. Outside Argentina, the record is dangerous enough without inflation. In much of the region, what appears more often are veins rather than the knife itself. Surveillance, logistics, and plans interrupted before blood fills the sidewalk. That distinction is the spine of the Latin American story. Argentina is where the confirmed, devastating, completed attacks sit most clearly in the public record. Elsewhere, what appears more often are support structures, financing, recruitment, facilitation, commercial cover, surveillance, and alleged or foiled plots. That pattern may be less cinematic than a crater in the street, but it is more useful for understanding how transnational militant ecosystems survive. They do not live only by spectacle. They live by infrastructure, by patient movement, and by the shadows cast by ordinary things. Now return to April of 2024, because this is where the legal language in Argentina becomes especially hard. The country's highest criminal court called the bombing a crime against humanity and said Hezbollah militants carried it out under an Iranian political and strategic design. That ruling also sharpened the answer to the old question of motive. The record now pointed to retaliation after Argentina backed away from nuclear cooperation with Tehran. The fog did not vanish, but the judicial wording became more direct than it had been in years. Even here, caution remains part of honesty. A court ruling is powerful, but it is not the same as suspects standing in a Buenos Aires courtroom answering questions face to face. Families still live in the long valley between naming and punishment. Tehran has denied involvement. Hezbollah has denied involvement. The legal and diplomatic record points one way. The denials point to another. And history keeps asking the same brutal question. What is justice worth when the accused remain far from the bench and time keeps burying witnesses under more time? Then came another turn of the screw. In June of 2025, an Argentine judge ordered a trial in absentia for 10 accused suspects in the AMIA case after a new law allowed that step for long-term fugitives. The accused included former Iranian officials and Hezbollah-linked suspects. Nearly 3 decades after the explosion, the state was still dragging the file forward, not toward full closure, but toward motion. Slow motion, imperfect motion, the kind of motion our region knows too well, where justice arrives limping, but still refuses to die. There is something painfully familiar in that rhythm, not because the crime was local in origin, but because the aftermath became recognizably Latin American. The waiting, the suspicion of cover-ups, the war between memory and power, the way families are asked to survive on anniversaries while officials promise that tomorrow, now yes, now finally, the fog will break. Sometimes justice does not arrive like thunder. Sometimes it drags itself forward in fragments, while the dead keep their places in photographs and the living keep counting years like rosary beads. And this is where conspiracy culture needs to be shown the door. There are always people ready to speak as if Latin America were only a passive stage where imported evil was performed, while locals stood around bewildered. That is an insult disguised as analysis. The record does not show helpless scenery. It shows prosecutors, judges, police, journalists, victims groups, Jewish institutions, and communities in the region, fighting for decades to name what happened. Loud fantasy often erases exactly the people who did the hardest work of remembering under pressure. At the same time, the record also refuses the lazy comfort of pretending every suspicious artery was harmless commerce, unfairly maligned by geopolitics. The sanctions, the charges, the police operations, the court findings, and the Interpol trail sketch something more disciplined than myth, a networked pattern of presence that was often covert, adaptable, and financially embedded. Not a constant open war, something quieter. In some ways, that is more chilling. A city can sometimes see a bomb coming only after years of failing to notice the hands that prepared the road for it. A recurring object keeps returning in this story: the border itself. A street corner in Buenos Aires, a community center entrance, a customs zone where three countries touch, a passport, a front company, a money transfer, a warrant moving across continents faster than justice can. Borders promise order on maps, but people who live near them know better. Borders can be walls, yes. They can also be lungs. They inhale goods, loyalties, cash, stories, and sometimes the people who know exactly how to use ambiguity as shelter. That is one reason Argentina matters so much here. Hezbollah can be described in the language of party, militia, social base, and regional strategy. In Buenos Aires, abstraction ends. For Latin America, that matters. It means the region was not merely observing the distant axis of conflict from behind glass. At least twice, devastatingly, it was made to host it. The foreign argument ceased to be foreign when it reached the sidewalk. So, the most defensible summary is also the most powerful one. Hezbollah's history in Latin America is an Argentine story first, and a regional support network story second. The clearest completed attacks are the embassy bombing of 1992 and the AMIA bombing of 1994. Beyond that, the record thickens more around finance, logistics, recruitment, surveillance, and foiled or alleged plots than around a long chain of proven mass casualty attacks. That is not a small story. And Iran remains central to that disciplined telling, not because every whisper in the hemisphere leads back to Tehran, but because the strongest prosecutorial and judicial line in Argentina keeps returning to the same design. Iran in the strategic role, Hezbollah in the operational one. The later sanctions, the Justice Department charges, the Interpol history, the court ruling in 2024, and the trial order in 2025 all reinforced that center of gravity. Denials remain part of the record. So does the accumulation against them. There is another reason the AMIA file refuses to die. The target was not a hidden military installation behind concrete and razor wire. It was a civilian Jewish community center, a place of ordinary rhythms where identity, care, paperwork, meetings, and neighborhood life were held together under one roof. An attack like that does not only seek bodies, it seeks to make belonging itself feel fragile. It tells a minority community that even its social heart can be mapped, watched, and shattered. That is why every stumble after the blast mattered so much. The memorandum with Iran mattered. Nisman's death, the corruption around the earlier investigation mattered. The later rulings mattered. When a state hesitates to punish a crime like this, it not only delays punishment, but also undermines its authority. It teaches people that memory may have to survive official institutions, almost despite them. Sometimes the first burial is human, the second burial is administrative. A nation can lose faith not only in protection, but in the archive itself. Walk Buenos Aires again, but now in the present tense of remembrance. Plaques, names read aloud, ceremonies under winter light, politicians speak carefully, survivors growing older, families who became archivists because they could not trust the state to carry the archive cleanly by itself. Every anniversary is both ritual and accusation. The city dresses the wound so it can still be seen, because unseen wounds in our region have a habit of being rewritten by whoever holds the microphone that season. And beyond Argentina, the wider lesson is not that Latin America is uniquely cursed, nor that every Lebanese merchant in a border town belongs to some hidden army. That framing is poison. The lesson is that transnational militant networks prefer seams, busy borders, opaque commerce, political distraction, weak coordination, and places where criminal facilitation and ideological commitment can overlap without always announcing which one is driving. Our region has such seams. Many regions do. That is why this story still matters. If there is irony here, it is a bitter one. Hezbollah grew out of a language of resistance in Lebanon, out of real histories of exclusion, invasion, and war. But in Buenos Aires, what the record preserves is not resistance. It is collapsed buildings, torn bodies, and a transnational trail of operatives and financiers. Movements often speak in the vocabulary of dignity and liberation. The rubble in Argentina asks a harsher question. Dignity for whom, if the method is to blast apart ordinary lives thousands of miles away? So how did a conflict born far away leave two craters in Argentina and a shadow over Latin America? Through alliances, through money, through casing work, through front companies, through quiet roots and patient operatives, through states that looked away or moved too slowly or fought over the archive while families were still counting the dead. By the time the bomb arrives, the journey has usually been long. The explosion is only the part the public can hear. Everything else has often been whispering for years from the edge of the frame, and that is why this story should not end in spectacle. The spectacular part happened twice in seconds. The more frightening part lasted decades. It lived in frozen assets, disputed commissions, red notices, dead prosecutors, court rulings, and border economies dense with ambiguity. It also lived in a stubborn truth. The clearest completed attacks were in Buenos Aires, while much of the wider regional story was built through finance, logistics, surveillance, and covert presence. Sometimes the deepest respect we can offer the dead is precision. That may be the haunting thought this story leaves behind. Foreign wars do not always break out with a bang. Sometimes they arrive first as a transfer, a casing trip, a front business, a diplomatic shrug, a corrupt official, a file left to yellow while families keep asking the same names to answer. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.